because it's 11 o'clock on the nose and I don't see anyone in the hallway, and I have to fit 2 federal laws into an hour. So we're going to start now. Go. So for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Mary Simioli. I started in March, so I'm new-ish. I'm the Title IX coordinator, and I also serve as the access officer. So the 2 areas that I'm primarily involved in are Title IX, so all gender-based misconduct that involves faculty, staff, students, any of our community members. And as far as the Americans with Disabilities Act and 504, I serve as the grievance officer. So if a student has any complaint or they want to file a claim against our institution, they work through me. So background about who I am and how I come to the table. Prior to coming to Springfield College, I served as a special victims prosecutor here in Hampden County. I'm an attorney by trade. I've done mostly non-discrimination law, so I've worked significantly with both of these federal laws. I've worked at state agencies in Massachusetts as well as Connecticut. I've had the opportunity to work with lots of different people and lots of different groups, and I think that's what makes these effective, is that we apply them to the spaces where you are. We're going to talk about what it means to apply them here at Springfield College. I do have some folks who are on Zoom. I do have folks who are watching from satellite campuses, so hello to them and thank you for joining us. If there are questions, I'm going to try and do questions kind of throughout the presentation and also at the end. I know it's a lot of information to intake at one time, so we're going to try and make it as easy as possible to do this. Another thing I want to add is I gave most of you a handout. I've actually run out of handouts. They will be provided in copious amounts at future trainings outside my office. They'll be delivered via email. But what we have here is the updated contact and points of contact and points of reference for Title IX. And we'll talk about how that can be used going forward. So if you didn't get one, I will get one to you. And I will have many, many more for coworkers and folks in your office as well. So let's get started. All right, so what are we doing here? Today we're going to talk about institutional policy at the place where it meets federal law. I feel like kind of say that Springfield College functions in a bubble, right? We're a nice, close-knit, small campus in a tight community. We have our own institutional policies. We also have federal mandates that we have to follow. So how do those things meet? Where do they interact? And what does that look like? We're going to talk about the can we talk. So regardless of how you know students, how you interact with students, or coworkers, remembering that these things apply not just to students, but also peers, faculty, staff, and students. Sometimes, right, or maybe it's already happened, a student's gonna come up to you and say, can we talk? Or a coworker's gonna say, can we talk? Right, and so that should send some flashing lights in your head to think back maybe to this session and some of the content that we'll cover today. So we're gonna talk about what to do when that talk happens. We're going to talk about what it means to be responsible, right? So responsible has lots of connotations when we think about responsible and how we understand it in our everyday language, right? Expectations about being on time and being a good person and doing the things you're supposed to do. But in this context, responsible has a legal definition. So we're going to talk about what that means and what your obligations are as a member of this campus community, and also what it means to be a good member of the campus community. And finally, we're going to talk about what best practices for your spaces are.
It's lovely, isn't it? There's always one.
Is it so boring already?
I really
So
don't
we're
know
going to talk about So let this serve as your reminder, if you can shut your phones off.
I'm sorry.
All right. But so we're going to talk about the spaces that you have ownership of, recognizing that not all members of our community are faculty members. You may have events that you plan through your department or your division. You may have spaces where you interact with faculty or staff relative to financial needs or class registration, or right, there's any number of interactions that you have throughout the day. So we're going to talk about things that you can do in best practices for the programs and spaces that you host or that you control. So that's going to be some of our major takeaways for the day. So when I think about Springfield College, one of the things I think is most unique is that every single person here knows our mission, right? I had recently applied and went through the interview process. Everyone I spoke to talked about the mission, and it's true. Even students, you walk up to a student, and what do they say? Spirit, mind, body, right? They all know this. That's their big takeaway, spirit, mind, body. They all do the hand thing, the triangle thing, right? They all know our mission. The part that sticks out to me most significantly is the phrase, the whole person. When we talk about the whole, That's what we're talking about when we talk about Title IX and Section 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're saying that we're going to take an individual and meet them where they are so that they can fully participate in their educational experience. That's all it is. I feel like I spend a significant amount of my time when we talk about political correctness, making sure people understand that we're just being respectful, right? Those are the same. When I talk about the whole person, when we talk about accommodations, when we talk about interim remedies and measures for Title IX, I'm talking about creating spaces that are safe and accessible for students. Fully participatory experience, right? That's all we're talking about. And when you think of it that way, it takes a lot of stress off of us. When we talk about federal laws and obligations, I think it invokes a lot of panic. I'm not doing this right. Do I get credit for trying? What does this mean? How expensive is this going to be? Right? But when you think about trying to create spaces that are healthy and accessible and welcoming, that's all that we're doing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. So like I said, when we talk about equity, we're talking about a student's ability, no matter what they look like or who they are or what their experiences have been, to access their education through the removal of barriers. So the removal of barriers, that's the legal phraseology that we have here. When we talk about Title IX in particular, the federal government and Springfield College see gender-based misconduct as a barrier to education. The example that I love to use here at Springfield College is our administrative quad. What don't students do here at Springfield College? Walk on the grass. They don't walk on the grass, right? We have pathways, which means students to get from place A to place B, faculty, staff, we all do it, right? We follow our pathways. So when I talk about a hostile environment, this is the example I like to use. If you go from Cheney to the campus union every day and you take the same path, right? Maybe someone yells something at you. Maybe they yell something at you that's inappropriate, and it makes you go, oh, I didn't like that. But you keep going. What happens if that person were to start following you down that pathway? What if every day, every time you took that pathway, that person were to be following you, yelling at you, screaming at you? What might you do? Take a different path. Maybe you walk on the grass, right? So when we talk about hostile environment, that's what we're talking about. That's what we mean by barriers. We mean things that prevent you from doing as a student, faculty, or staff member, the things that you normally do, removing you from the pathways you normally take, right? So if I don't feel safe because someone who's engaged in acts of gender-based misconduct sits next to me in class, maybe I'm not going to go to that class, right? Or maybe I don't feel safe in my residence hall because that person lives across the hall. I'm no longer going to want to occupy that normal space, that normal path. So the removal of barriers, that's what we're talking about. All right, so who's responsible here? Everyone said, not me. Luckily, everyone is. We all are. Well, you three aren't. Congratulations. So, in accordance with our gender-based misconduct policy, every single employee of Springfield College, unless they are a confidential resource, like our counseling folks here, you're considered a responsible employee. So you don't have to be a faculty member, you don't have to be an RA, it doesn't mean that you interact with students all day, every day. If you are employed by Springfield College, unless you have a big old asterisk next to your job description, you're considered a responsible employee. So some big caveats about what it means to be a responsible employee. I think the best part about being a responsible employee is that it's pretty easy. And by that I mean, responsibility is about knowledge. And so when we talk about these two federal terms, Title IX versus 504, there are knowledge requirements. And that is to say that if you know something as an individual, the law says Springfield College as a whole knows it. Now there are two different types of knowledge-based requirements that we're going to talk about, and this can be a little confusing. Title IX says if you knew or should have known, Springfield College knows. When you think about what's in the news, Ohio State, Michigan State, right? All these cases, all these examples where staff members were aware, coaching staff was aware, faculty was aware. It doesn't matter if the president of the college knew or not. They said you knew, someone told you, so the whole institution knows and is therefore responsible. So when it comes to Title IX, any act of gender-based misconduct, that can include stalking, that can include sexual harassment, it can include physical manifestations like sexual assault, you have to tell someone, because if you knew, that means everyone in this room knows, right? We are given knowledge simply by your knowledge, whether it's actual or not, knew or should have known. The other important thing about imputed knowledge is that it's not your decision to make a decision, right? You have to report it. When I say it's easy, what I really mean is that you find out, you tell the appropriate channels, and they have to deal with the rest, right? When you think about your bias, when you think about your own personal experiences, none of that comes into play. It's actually a really easy role to play. I heard something, it made me feel weird, I passed it on, and my job is done, right? Especially looking at Ohio State, everything that's going on with their coach, right? They're now saying that the coach of their football team notified their athletic director. So originally fingers were pointing at him, and now he's saying, I told the AD I did the thing I was supposed to do, right? So not to say, oh, you can put your hands in the air, but if you knew, all you have to do is tell someone. That's kind of the big important piece. When we talk about ADA 504, case law tells us that it's actual knowledge. That means that you have no obligation to make assumptions about how students, faculty, or staff come to the table and interact with you, right? We don't interact with students and make assumptions about their physical, mental, or emotional needs. Unless you are explicitly told, this is my need, this is my challenge, you don't know, you can't know, right? You hear a lot of times people talk about invisible disabilities. We talk about mental health and wellness, we talk about learning disabilities, right? You can't see someone and know what their immediate needs are. So 504 requires actual knowledge. And that makes it even easier because you literally get a slip of paper in the mail that tells you everything you need to know. So the knowledge piece, what I would say the big takeaway is, assume it's new or should have known. If you're doing programming, every person who has a disability may not tell you, may not make a disclosure, but if you function from a place where you're assuming that you want to create an accessible program, you're going to be doing all right. If you knew or should have known when it comes to Title IX instances, it's better to tell me, tell a deputy coordinator, tell someone on staff, and then have me say, that's not a problem, or it's different than you think it is, or that's a conduct issue, not a Title IX issue. So we're going with better safe than sorry in that kind of instance. So the can we talk? What does this look like? Oh, yes,
so
go ahead.
how do we know, or are you going to cover later, how do we know who to report stuff to?
We're going to cover it.
Excellent.
Great question. Thanks for doing the audience. All right. So the can we talk? So when it comes to responsibility, it's important to understand, again, your different obligations. We also need to understand if your status mandates reporting and when it doesn't. So again, going back to the concept of Title IX versus 504, any incident involving a student with a gender-based misconduct incident, a conversation, right? You have to disclose that. It's not optional. You cannot look a student in the eye, you cannot look a peer in the eye, you cannot look someone from your division and say, we'll talk about this confidentially, right? There are only, to my knowledge, 3 folks in the room at this point who have the authority to be a confidential resource. So maybe you've had to say it, maybe you haven't, but my best practice is always to say, first of all, thank you for coming to me. I appreciate that you trust me and you want to talk to me about this, but I have to let you know that if you share anything that could be perceived as sexual assault or gender-based misconduct, I have to report it to the institution, right? That's your obligation. Again, when you think about your own experiences, your own bias, whether you believe a person or not, whether you think something is gender-based misconduct or not, it's not for you to decide, right? So it's really easy passing along that information, but you have to give students that heads up. You have to give peers that heads up, right? We don't just function as a business or as an educational institution, right? The folks that you work with, hopefully, right? Your friends, right? They're gonna come to you, you're gonna talk about your lives, you're gonna talk about your experiences. Even in that setting, you have to look to your good friend and coworker and say, before you tell me this, you have to realize I have to report it to the institution. Again, using Ohio State as an example because it's prime in the news right now. A coach and an assistant coach, right? I'm gonna function under the assumption that they're good buddies, that they're good friends, that they talk about their lives, right? The news is saying that their wives were good friends, that they socialized as families, right? Even in that setting, because they were both university employees, they had an obligation to report to their institution. So when it doesn't, this is, I think, where people get a little confused and panicky. When you talk about accommodations and you talk about 504, a student comes to you and maybe they express frustration. Oh, I'm so frustrated, I'm having a hard time getting around campus. or I feel like my faculty member is in X, Y, and Z, and you go, I have to tell someone, I have to call the FBI and the authorities, and we have to let everybody know, and you're like, I don't really know who to let know. Sometimes students are gonna tell you things because they trust you, right? Sometimes faculty or staff members are gonna tell you things because you have personal relationships with them. When it comes to 504 and accommodations, remember it's actual knowledge. So if there's an issue, if there's a crisis, our policy mandates that all persons in our community self-identify. They may or may not choose to self-identify with our institution. They may or may not choose to self-identify with any given faculty or staff member. You are in that role then as a person of support, as a friend, as a soundboard, but it's not your job to call Andrew Wilcox and report a violation, right? Because those violations are self-driven. It's not the same. It's a personal matter. You're not an expert in their diagnosis, right? You don't know what their needs are. You're not in control of their course load, the spaces that they occupy, and so on. So you can be a good friend in those instances. You can share resources. Obviously, that's what we'd hope you would do. But know that it's a little less stress when you hear about issues or frustration when it comes to ADA and 504 and accessibility issues. So we can talk a lot more about that. All right. So focusing on Title IX again briefly, you must report any incidents of gender-based misconduct. Again, I feel like every time we've done a training in the last maybe year or so, everyone brings up the Me Too movement, right? So I'm kind of laughing. There's a big Title IX case that came out of NYU pretty recently. It was just published. It was an 11-month-long investigation, and people are saying, oh, this darn Me Too movement, and I'm sitting over here like, it's been the law since the 70s. You're right. Like that hashtag really carried us over the line, right? So yes, that's important and it gets people talking and people thinking, but these instances are not new, right? It's been happening as long as human beings have roamed the earth, right? When we think about gender-based misconduct, what is new is our understanding of what is harassment, right? Until the early 90s, our Supreme Court didn't recognize sexual harassment in the workplace as a form of discrimination. Until 1992, the Supreme Court thought gender-based discrimination was related only to finances and payment. So if I paid you unequally, bad, but if I smacked your butt in the workplace, that's not a problem, right? And you're like, excuse me, what, right? So our understanding of that has changed. And the reality is our understanding really hasn't changed. The acceptance of that as inappropriate, our educational levels, equity in the workplace, that's what's changed, right? So when we're thinking about gender-based misconduct, I think the easiest way to describe it is you know it when you see it, right? When you feel it, you're probably correct. And again, if you report something and we find through an investigation that a person's not responsible or that it's not creating a hostile environment, that's not your problem. But keeping in mind that it's physical manifestations, so sexual assault, sexual harassment, it's also non-physical forms, sexual harassment, stalking, right, biased behaviors. Yes, Bree?
Question from online. So does an incident mean that I witnessed it happen, or incident more as an allegation?
Both. So knew or should have known means I observed it, I saw it with my own eyes, I was explicitly told, or I heard two people in front of me in the hallway talking about it. If you have imputed knowledge of any incident of gender-based misconduct, you then become responsible for reporting that to the institution. So if you walk into the cafeteria in your office space or your break room and two other folks are in there and they're talking about an experience, or if you walk into that same break room and you see a coworker sexually harassing another coworker, you're also responsible. You can either be told or witness it yourself, either one. So knew or should have known, that's that characterization. So again, Title IX dictates how we evaluate each individual instance, and every investigation is conducted on an individual basis. We look at each case one-on-one. But again, as a mandatory reporter, as a responsible employee, your job is easy. You don't have to be an investigator. You don't have to make any evaluations. You don't have to determine whether you believe that person or not, right? I think part of the challenge in this role is people want to do the right thing. When we hear about delayed disclosures, right, referencing kind of this Me Too movement, it's really common for folks to say, oh, it happened so long ago, right? But, right, Counseling Center, back me up. When we think about the trauma brain, right, how your brain processes trauma, that has a significant impact on when folks make disclosures. Again, not your job to make a determination about whether it happened or not. Not your job to make a determination as to whether you believe that person or not. Being a good community member here at Springfield College means you do your due diligence, you report when necessary, right? And then you kind of get to walk away, which is nice. We don't get to do that a lot. Yes?
I have a question based on reporting. So like within residence halls, if a student has a guest who has no affiliation with Springfield College, would the reporting process be different because they're not part of the Springfield College community, or would it still go through like your office and then might reach out to somebody else?
I'm smiling because that's a really good question. So, Title IX follows students, faculty, and staff members wherever they go. It is also specific to Springfield College campus. So if you're a community member, if you're a vendor, Airmark are Airmark employees, right? The folks who work in Cheney, they're not technically Springfield College employees. They're independently contracted by our institution. They are still protected by Title IX because they're on this campus. Guests of this campus. It follows our students wherever they go. So let's say our students have friends from high school who go to the University of Massachusetts, right? They go up to Amherst, they go to UMass, and they do something wrong at UMass. A student at UMass could file with their institution. They could also file here at the college. So if you hear of anything involving a student, I was on spring break in Cabo, X, Y, and Z, Title IX follows you to Cabo. I'm not following them to Cabo. Right? But it follows them wherever they go in March. Right? But so keeping that in mind, you may hear, right, retroactive, oh, you know, I was on spring break and X, Y, and Z happened. That's still notice, right? That's you knew or should have known. Because when we talk about Title IX, it's not just about interim remedies. It's not just about trespassing someone from campus or a finding of responsibility or not responsibility. It's making sure that the members of our community are connected to the appropriate resources. Do they need counseling services for something that happened while they were in Cabo, right? Do they need to be connected to community organizations, right? What kind of resources do they need to make sure, again, that they're a whole person and they can fully participate? So Title IX follows you wherever you go as a student or a member of our community, and it's also local to our campus. So like I said, if you're a vendor, if you're a community member, if you're a guest, and something happens at Springfield College, it can still be processed through our policy. Yes?
So when you're talking about delayed disclosures, if someone's referring to something that happened before they were a member of the Springfield College community, is that still something we need to report back?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm having a hard time in class, I just been thinking about my freshman year in high school and yada yada.
Yeah, because again, going back to the concept of resources, we also know that when we think about behaviors, when we think about trauma, right, it may take 5 or 10 years for an individual to process those experiences. If a student is in, let's say, the same living situation, using my background as a prosecutor, I have, you know, we would have cases where something happened to a child who, when they were really young, fast forward 5, 10, 15 years, they're still living in that same home situation. So our ability to check in with students and make sure that they're safe in their current environment, again, that they don't need resources, that's what that becomes, right? And again, it's better to say, let me report it, and if nothing comes out of it, no problem, right? So it's all about it's not always about investigation, it's about connecting folks to resources. But anything that's gender-based misconduct now, present, freshman year of high school, on spring break, should all be reported. Yeah, there's another question.
I think you've answered it. I was just thinking about students who are placed in hospitals and other healthcare settings where what we've seen is gender-based misconduct, patient to student clinician.
Mm-hmm. So if we're looking at a clinical setting.
Yeah, and that's what so my question has 2 parts. Clinical setting, I think I got the answer. It's reportable, because we'll hear about it. Second part is, are our partners aware of this? So we work with some fairly large, you know, Trinity Health.
Sure.
And how is this embedded in our contracts with them?
So by our being an institution, it doesn't matter that we're a private institution, it doesn't matter if an institution is public, anyone who receives federal funding is mandated under Title IX. Anytime an individual institution enters into a contract or partnership with us, it doesn't have to be written. It's a federal mandate by our pure existence. So you don't have to contractually say, we're bound by Title IX. It's automatically included. The other piece is that it's also a function of Title VII, which is the employment sexual harassment. So even if for whatever reason their policy if they want to, if a student, for example, chooses to pursue their in-house policy, it'd be protected under Title VII, which is, again, you can't contractually include or write away people's constitutional rights. So-
And the federal funding is educational funding or any federal funding?
Federal funding, educational funding.
Okay.
So we receive federal funding as an educational
Right,
institution.
but it would-
In the same way that we tie states to the drinking age, right? The drinking age of 21 isn't a federal mandate, it's a state mandate, but we say we're not gonna give you highway money if you don't do it, right? It's the same thing. So if you want our federal educational dollars for financial aid, you have to adhere to Title IX. So Title IX follows students to those spaces, but also Title VII protects you as well. We live in a unique place because we have employees at a higher educational institution, so we function under Title IX and Title VII, which is why I have a job. All right, so again, 504 ADA, kind of switching gears now. It's a little bit different. We talked a lot about this already. The primary piece that I want to talk about is the voluntary nature of a disclosure. Students do not have to disclose to anyone they don't want to. A student can come to Springfield College and never ever make a disclosure about a mental, emotional, or learning-oriented need that they have, right? None of us walk around with our bill of health on our shoulders. No student has to do that. That being said, they may also disclose in a way that's really exclusive. If you're in a physical therapy or athletic training program, for example, they may only choose to disclose to their clinical instructors where it can affect their ability to participate. But maybe they don't tell their freshman writing seminar faculty member. Maybe they don't tell their residence assistant because it doesn't affect them in their living space, right? So that's one, it's completely voluntary. Second, a diagnosis of a student is always, always, always confidential and private. That being said, if no matter what your capacity is, you receive a letter of accommodation, you can ask, how can I best accommodate you? You can talk to Andrew Wilcox and the folks at the Academic Success Center and say, here are my essential learning outcomes for my program, or here are the essential learning outcomes for the space that I've created or for my class. How can I best reach those outcomes with this accommodation? You cannot ever ask a student why they need this accommodation. Again, it's pretty easy. You get a paper that tells you exactly what you have to do. You're not a clinician. And if you are a clinician, you're not serving the college in the capacity of a clinician, right? You're not an expert in diagnoses. It's not your job to evaluate whether it's necessary or not. The thing that I will tell you is that for a student to get a letter of accommodation, they have to have documentation from a medical professional. So I think, again, when we're talking about political correctness versus just, being a good human person, right? When you come to the table and someone says, I need this accommodation, it's not your job to cast judgment, to make a determination about, you don't look like you need this, or you don't need it that much, or, this is ridiculous, right? It's not your job. You just have to do what's in the letter, but you also have to trust our process and trust the system to know that the student got the appropriate level of documentation from their clinician. So whether it's mental health, whether it's a physical disability or a learning disability, we actually have a 6-step process to get a letter of accommodation. So I think a lot of folks think like, I'm tired, or my student doesn't like to study, so they get time and a half. Not even close. It's literally a 6-step process. When we walk parents, faculty, staff through the process about getting accommodations, I'm like, all right, step 1 of 100, right? It's intensive and it's significant, but it's also private. Again, you're not asked to share any of your personal medical information with anyone. No student will ever be asked to share that as well. So if you see a letter, a student might disclose to you, they might tell you, but that's based on your personal relationship, that's based on your dynamic, that's based on some trust that you build over time. But again, it is exclusive to their voluntary disclosure, and at the end of the day, it's none of our business.
May I have a question?
Yes.
This might be too specific for the group, and we can talk about it offline if it is. I work in admissions frequently. Sometimes we'll get either the student or the parent will spontaneously send their 504 plan. I usually use that as, I don't read it, I use it as a dialogue, like here are the services, if this is who you should check with.
Perfect.
I can't have that conversation with the parent because of first, so it's kind of, how does that all, am I doing the right thing?
Yes. Yes. So this is just some background. So this is another space where I love like the it's confusing, right? And it's
Yeah.
hard, and you're like, am I doing the right thing? FERPA, am I breaking laws? FBI, what's happening, right? Who's watching it? The concept of helicopter parents, right? We love to talk about first year students and be like, ugh, these helicopter parents. These helicopter parents, right?
Older students.
Helicopter parents, right? So, fun fact, maybe lay off the helicopter parents for like 5 minutes. At least on this regard, you can totally get back on them about something else, right? When they try and add money to their 24-year-old's meal plan. You're like, maybe not, right? But when we're talking about 504 plans and IEPs, most public schools, so if you have a student in your course or in your residence hall or in a program that you facilitate, automatically renew in public school systems. So if you have a child who's evaluated for a need, maybe when they're in 5th grade, the school automatically renews their IEP plan on an annual basis. Parents may have to do a meeting, it may be evaluated institutionally or administratively without them having to lift a finger, right? So a lot of parents are confused because the last time they had this conversation was when their child might have been 10 or 12 or 15, right? A significant number of mental health and wellness issues and learning disabilities appear in children as they start to go through puberty, as they're experiencing hormonal changes. So a lot of times parents are saying, you know, I haven't talked about this since we were 14 and now we kind of don't know what to do, right? Because now that they're switching over to college, we're not in the same system. We're also changing over from IEPs, where they used to share them with faculty, to 504 accommodations, which are not shared with everyone, like we just said. They're shared on a voluntary basis. So there is some confusion about that. If a student shows up and says, you know, I don't have extended time like I thought I was gonna have because they assumed that it would magically and automatically kind of come with them, which may be what you're getting the brunt of. Connect them to me, connect them to Andrew Wilcox, and we can help them walk through the process. We also have policies and procedures in place that if a student shows up on test day, and this has happened, they show up on test day and they say, I'm supposed to have extended time, and a faculty member says, oh, that's interesting. Take a seat, right? We have mechanisms in place for communicating with faculty and staff in instances like that if something were to happen. But like I said, maybe don't cut them all to slack, don't do it for them, but understanding that most of our students are coming from backgrounds where these are being renewed automatically. So that could be a significant challenge. The other thing I wanna, oh yes.
Sorry, real quick, also from admissions, when we receive the 504 plans, they then follow the student with the file. So in terms of disclosure, they disclose with admissions, but traditionally we pass the file along then to the registrar's office, or we share that information with students of concern committee or whatever. How does that work? Are we
So
doing
a best
the right thing?
No, okay. So best practice, again, when we think about FERPA and HIPAA and the overlap of what that looks like, disclosures, again, part of the challenge is folks are coming from so many different backgrounds. Public schools, private schools, prep schools, students who are just being evaluated for accommodation needs for the very first time ever, who, you know, maybe they or their families are like, I don't know what to do, who are on the street, look at this form, what does it mean, right? So understanding kind of the role of serving as gatekeepers. If you get that information, at this point, the best practice is to return it to the family or shred it, really, and then refer them to services in the Academic Success Center. Because as, you know, in the registrar's office, they don't need to see clinical diagnoses, right? Again, it's voluntary disclosure. So if I'm passing around the student's information and my history of mental health and wellness is included in that file, I haven't had the opportunity to voluntarily disclose who I am as a person, what my needs are, or what I want my experience to be. If we think about students, for example, who have had challenges with mental health and wellness, and when it comes to things like suicide or family trauma, right? Maybe something that happened in your childhood that's recorded in your minor medical records doesn't need to follow you to your time at Springfield College, right? So keeping in mind that that takes away our ability, or takes students' ability away to voluntarily disclose. So making sure that if you see something, you go, oh, I know what you need, here, let me give you one of, you know, these phone numbers, here's our website. That's best practice, but we don't want to include it in a general student file.
So what happens if a student discloses in their admissions essay? That is kind of the same idea, because those follow the student as well to other offices.
So that's what I would consider a voluntary disclosure.
Okay.
So if they're including it in their admissions essay and they're talking about, because of this X, Y, and Z disability, I have built character, please admit me to your college, right? It's not
really familiar.
Mine was about the Red Sox, just so you know where I'm at. The audacity of hope.
Yeah.
Like, I was Obama before he was. It's fine. So when you're talking about that kind of statement or disclosure, it's not a medical record, right? And so that's the significant difference, is you're not sharing medical records, you're not sharing diagnoses. A student might say, I have anxiety, but unless they've been diagnosed with clinical anxiety or generalized anxiety, right, those are two totally different understandings oftentimes. So if it's something like that, that's you've asked them to complete it and they have.
Also from admissions, another follow-up question. So sometimes we have families or the student contact us and say, I'm going to be sending my accommodation plans in. Can you get them to the right office? If they give us permission like that, should we still be sending it back to them or referring them to send it directly to?
I would prefer it to be sent directly to academic success, because they're, as disability support services, one, it takes liability off of your office.
Yeah.
And my lawyer background and also my human person background tells me, like, anything that I don't have to be blamed for, I don't want to be blamed for, right? So always deferring immediately to the office or to you, but to their attention.
Okay.
I think would be the best practice. If you're working with a family and there's confusion, or we're not sure how to get this process started, send it to you, attention, disability support services. That's what I would say kind of next step, because then you don't even have to open the envelope. So any other questions about that? Okay. So the last thing I'm going to hit in this point is there's a significant difference between self-advocacy and expertise. When it comes to disabilities, we often expect students who have a physical, mental disability, who have physical challenges, right, to be experts on the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? I literally have a job because I'm being paid by the college to pretend to be an expert on the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? It's unreasonable and ridiculous to ask a student to be an expert. Yes, throw back to the helicopter parents. Our students have to self-advocate. Again, actual knowledge. If they need something, they need to tell us. If they need something from a programming facility or from the space where they live or from the spaces they go to class, they have to tell us, otherwise we can't know. But the other side of that is you can't look at a 19-year-old and be like, section 504.b subletter A says this, so figure it out, right? Right, that's ridiculous. In no other area of your life, right? I think about my mom as a nurse, right? And when I was a kid, if I got hurt or if I was sick, right, she could wear the nurse hat for so long, and then something happened that was personal, and what happens in those situations, right? She was just another mom of a sick kid or a hurt kid, right? The expectation that we put on students to be experts in every area of this is unreasonable. So yes, you have to self-advocate, you have to communicate, you have to ask questions, you have to ask for what you need, but to look at a student and say, I don't understand why you don't understand this, is pretty ridiculous, and we do it a lot. Yes?
Question from online. So they have a scenario. A student approaches an ADA coordinator about a request to receive accommodations. While they're collecting the appropriate medical documents, they request some type of accommodations prior to the college deciding if the student is eligible. Are we obligated, and to what degree, to offer some layers of student support in the interim? And how do we handle this type of situation? So it's not processed. They get in there and they need help, but what do we do?
So that's a great question. I feel like that's how you respond, right, to all questions, right? Great question. So this is kind of the crossover between interim remedies in the Title IX world and interim remedies when it comes to 504 accommodations. As an institution, we are not liable for any 504 or ADA accommodations without documentation. However, if a student comes forward, let's say documentation is being processed late, some types of insurance don't allow you, right, to get referred out to a specialist without first seeing your primary care. We're also dealing with students who sometimes when they become 18, right, they're taking on new insurance. This happens all the time. There are lots of issues sometimes getting this documentation. This is a practice in human compassion at that point, right? As an institution, we can't make you legally liable. If a student says, since I was 10, I've had time and a half, and I know you want to give a quiz on the first day of school, but I need time and a half, but I don't have my letter yet, it's coming soon. We can't make anyone respect that, but taking into consideration that this is a significant reality. Again, students who come here when they turn 18, some are leaving their parents' insurance, some are, joining the school insurance, and like I said, there's all sorts of issues. If you're relocating, for example, from out of state, and you have to get documentation from a local clinician because your out-of-state clinician will no longer see you, right? What does that mean for a student? So a practice in human compassion and understanding, you can individually work with a student to ask about their needs, and I think it's pretty significant. Again, disclosure is voluntary. So if a student is coming to you and saying, I need help, what does this look like? My recommendation for any faculty or staff member, anyone teaching or doing programming, would be to call the Disability Support Services office and get recommendations about what you can do specifically for your course or your program. Because there's also, right, when we talk about being reasonable, right, that's the expectation under 504 is being reasonable. If a student says I need time and a half, a student is not saying I need unlimited time. Those are two totally different things, right? But we also want to keep in mind the title of this slide, right? That bartering is a barrier. We have power, right? I know we kind of say, oh, students, we're adults. Adults are, students are adults, yes, but we are older adults. We are professional adults. We work in professional capacities that students don't. We have power. You wake up in the morning, doesn't that feel good? You wake up in the morning and you come to work and you have power, right? Anytime you barter with a student over their rights to access, that's a barrier to education. Because an 18-year-old who says, I need time and a half, or I need double time, if a faculty member says, I'll give you time and a half, what's the student gonna say?
Okay.
Okay, that sounds good, I'll take that, right? It's panic, right? So working directly with the Office of Disability Support Services, Academic Success Center, working with me, we can address those issues on an ongoing basis. But they definitely do happen, and they happen all the time. And like I said, some students are genuinely in shock when they show up and they're like, what do you mean you didn't get my IEP plan? And a faculty member says, those don't exist. Welcome to college, right? It happens all the time. So it's not unheard of. But we don't want to put students in a position to barter for their rights. Ooh. Oh, let's get that. Okay, so some best practices for our spaces. And so there are lots of different spaces. So I'd love to get a feel to see kind of who's in the room. So faculty. Yay, welcome. Thanks for coming. Anyone who plans programs. Awesome. Who hosts events for families or the public? Okay, awesome. Who manages a physical space? Awesome. So hopefully we touch on useful pieces for each of those experiences, knowing that a significant number overlap. So I first want to talk a lot about the concept of universal design. The most important takeaway for universal design that we don't talk about enough is that you get credit for trying, right? Marsh as a building is at the very, right, it's a beautiful building. It's what, 105 years old?
The least accessible.
The least accessible building, right? ADA is not coming in and saying, oh, Department of Education says you have to knock down every 100-year-old building that you have, right? No one is saying that. I think we're really quick to assume like, oh, this darn federal government wants to light our campus on fire and ruin everything we've built, right? Slow down, everyone, all right? Like take a breath, right? We get credit for trying. Americans with Disability Act recognizes that we have limitations in time, space, and finances, right? So if we have to make a priority list of we're gonna do these things as we find out about that challenge, we're allowed to do that. Or if we say, we're gonna allot X number of dollars per year to make our campus as accessible as possible, we're allowed to do that. That being said, we also handle cases relative to accommodations or physical disability or limitation on a case-by-case basis. You have to know that universal design does not actually mean universal design. We will never have a campus that is made for every single body that is on this earth. It's not possible because everyone's needs, their mobility limitations, they're different, right? Every single person. So universal design is about doing the best we can at the end of the day, and from a genuine perspective of doing the best we can. So as you're planning programs and as you're organizing your spaces, it's not necessarily about making it perfect. It's about taking what you know, right? Using what you have to do the best we possibly can at that time. So some of the main concepts that I'd love for everyone to think about when they're planning events, when they're organizing physical spaces, are these major concepts. So when we talk about flexible use, Let me get to my right page here. Sorry, I'm getting lost. Okay, so when we, excuse me, we'll start with equitable use. When we talk about equitable use, we're talking about a space that's accessible, right? If you're planning an admissions event in March, for example, who have you now told we don't want at Springfield College?
Everybody who needs it.
Right, folks with accessibility needs. Identify your audience for the spaces that we're using, right? If you want to have everyone in the community participate, you need to keep that in mind. As an able-bodied person, this is something I was working with a student group at another institution, and we realized we were hosting some student events in an upstairs facility that had a really old, we didn't even have an elevator, we had a lift that takes about 25 minutes. That was like 5 seconds and wasn't that awkward, right?
Yeah.
So we kind of had to have a conversation with our students. We can't be planning events in these spaces and then get frustrated or upset when people don't come. Because we've sent a message to the community and the campus population that maybe we don't want some of you here by the way we facilitate our space or the physical space we've reserved. So keeping that in mind. The second is flexibility in use of that space. So design accommodations have a wide range based on individual preferences, right, and individual needs. And like I said, we're never going to be perfect, but recognizing that, for example, someone who has a visual impairment might not be able to see my PowerPoint presentation. What's an alternative? Could I print it out and make copies of the slides available at the door? Yes. Wow, what a good community member I am. Was it incredibly stressful? Was it incredibly time consuming? No, it wasn't. But it made a significant difference. That's not to say, right, people are really quick to say like, oh, just because one person can't see your presentation now means you can't do a presentation. No, that's not what I said, right? It's about using what we have, right, and doing the best we can. So keeping in mind, people might have different audio or visual needs. Are you using a text in your course? I'm guilty of this myself. I have newspaper articles that I use when I teach that I love, right? They're perfect. They're exactly what I needed. They're exactly what I wanted. Can I get them in large print? No, right? Do I need to find something else to use? Yes. A little bit of educational labor on my part. Or do I need to make accommodations? Is it up to me to scale the document so it can be read? Yes, that's appropriate. Do I need to make sure that it's not covered in black and white flickery pieces when I hand out printouts? Yes, because any student with a visual impairment might not be able to utilize that resource. So then the document that I thought was so wonderful and amazing becomes useless, right? So there are lots of different things that we can do, and we can also be creative. I want to show you, I don't think, oh, there it is. So this is a casual throwback, right? Does anyone know what movie this is? Silverado. It's fine, whatever. This is just an example. So I wanted to show this clip the last time I did a presentation on accessibility because it's awesome. So I'll let you watch it real quick.
What can I do you for, stranger?
Oh no. I'm ruining my whole...
What can I do you for, stranger?
You work here?
I run the place. What can I get you?
Bourbon.
What?
Nothing.
The world is what you make of it, friend. If it doesn't fit, make alterations.
I'll drink to that. Join me. Just
Stella.
hey.
Scandalous. All right, well.
It's actually
So I was so excited about showing because that's one of my favorite references to make. That's what ADA is all about, right? Making alterations, right? It's not about ruining lives and traditions and all these things that people really want it to be about. It's just not. I'm so sorry that you wasted your anger. But I said I'm doing a presentation on accessibility, and I'm about to show a video that's not accessible. So I'm a huge loser, right? So what I did was I actually found all the language online, and it didn't work. when I tried to throw it into this presentation. But what I did was I used the fly-in feature of on PowerPoint, and the text just scrolled along the bottom. So it read as closed captioning. I couldn't find it in closed captioning. It took me a total of 5 minutes, right? Another alternative would again be to just print out the dialogue, or to have the next slide include the dialogue, right? It doesn't have to be complicated, it doesn't have to be expensive, you don't have to fly in tools from the Netherlands to help you make things accessible to students. But right, when we think about flexibility in use, we want to be flexible with how we communicate, recognizing that people have different needs. Simple and intuitive use. How many of you are iPhone users? Nice, good example, right? When you, or if you have ever tried to use an Android, who goes like, oh, I don't know how to use this, right? You're like, what does this mean? Or if you're an Android user and you try and switch to an iPhone, your notion of what's simple and intuitive is there. It's hard to teach and talk about because it's an innate human interaction. Like, I think the best example of this, and maybe this is me just being so Italian right now, is when you're in a kitchen, and let's say you're at a family member's house or a friend's house and you're helping them prepare dinner, and you go to reach for the silverware, and it's not where you want it to be, right? Has that ever happened to you? Or, you're helping family and you're like, oh, sure, let me grab that for you without ever having done it or knowing where it is. And it's right where you want it to be. And you're like, yes, you've done good, right? Simple and intuitive use, right? It's an innate human interaction. We expect things physically to be in certain places. So don't go against that, right? Entryways deserve wide aisles. That makes sense. Like, this little configuration was a little bit smaller before, and people were like, oh, I'll just do this instead of opening the door wider, right? Don't fight your intuitive use or your intuitive expectations. When you're looking at programs or when you're looking at forms, if you say, that looks weird or silly, it probably is. So keeping in mind that we have a natural expectation for how things should be and where they should be, and your own intuition is probably shared, right? And like I said, I can't stop thinking about when you go to that friend's house and you reach for the forks in the drawer, the disappointment when they're not there, or the satisfaction, like when they are, right? That's our shared human experience from the Italian perspective. So the next is when we talk about, again, designing information for the user, recognizing sensory needs. So one example that I have here is when you're doing print pieces, nothing should be smaller than a size 14 font. When you're doing presentations like this, nothing here is smaller than a size 28. That's what ADA, that's what the Department of Education has found is generally the best size for most folks. Again, not for everyone. Some people want like one letter per slide, and that can't happen. But even small changes like that, it affected my ability to give this presentation 0%. Apply to an entire document, problem solved, right? So there are small things that you can do that don't require disclosures that allow you to be respectful of different sensory needs. So the next one is tolerance for error. The design that minimizes hazards or consequences or accidents is the best. Makes sense, right? Again, with the liability piece, we don't want people tripping or falling or getting hurt. If you say, ooh, that looks a little tight, it probably is, right? If I move this table a little bit closer to the seat, I'm like, ooh, that's probably a bad idea. So it is a bad idea, right? So minimizing hazards, making pieces low physical effort. So ADA actually, when we talk about compliance with physical spaces, one of the requirements is actually about doors. We can't have the weight of a door be more than 15 pounds. If you think about an individual who's using crutches, for example, even in a temporary disability, or a wheelchair user, for example, the ability to move 30 pounds horizontally becomes really significant, right? How many of you, like I think about my grandparents, right? My grandmother had to walk with a walker, and she's now pushing the door, right? Or it always makes you feel really good when like your parent or your grandparent is like, oh, can you lift this bag of flour? And you're like, oh yeah, I got you. Like, I'm amazing, right? All of a sudden you feel like master of the universe, you're so strong, right? That's not a sensation that we want on our campus. So when you're thinking about physical limitations, it's important to keep those things in mind. Things that, again, as able-bodied persons, you may take for granted your ability to open a door, but if a door feels heavy to you, imagine again, a person who uses a wheelchair, a person using crutches, a person who has to carry another mobility device with them. If your expectation for participation in an event is relative to carrying lots of heavy objects or moving pieces around, keep in mind what that looks like as well. And again, the size and space for approach and use. So if you have frequently used items in your classroom, putting the most used items at a lower space, right? Keeping them at 36 inches or below. Don't put the things that your students are going to use in your class or at your program or in your residence program on the top shelf. That doesn't make sense, right? It's a lot easier for me to bend my knees than it is for someone who uses a wheelchair to get up to a top shelf, right? So keeping use simple and keeping spaces simple. So that's, again, some universal design concepts. The next piece, like I said, when we talk about advertising, sharing, and different resources, considering sizes of fonts makes a big difference. Have a plan B. Like the video I just tried to show you with an example of good accommodation services did not work. What happens if I'm in a space and I have students and it did not work and they say, okay, like thanks for trying, but what's my plan B? Or if you have parents in an admission session, right, and parents say, oh, I would have really liked to be a participant in this program, right? When it comes to things like June orientation, what's our plan B? So take time to think. I don't have time to do printouts for everyone, but maybe I'll just do a few just in case this doesn't work, right? Even things like that. And again, informational. Provide contact information that allows participants in your programs or spaces to contact if they need additional support or services. So you're not planning your program around any individual need, known or unknown, but if you have an event poster and you say, for accommodations, contact, name, phone number, email, super easy. No one might respond. Or you might have a couple people that say, you know, I need an aisle space, you know, can I get upstairs? What's elevator access look like? Right? It's as easy as saying, if you need something, let us know. Yeah.
Mary, on that topic, is there any place on this campus that we can go look and see what buildings are accessible and where things are?
So there's an accessibility map that we're actually having published for this. It'll go out in a mass email. But the accessibility map will now highlight all accessible entrances to all buildings on the campus and highlight accessible parking spaces.
Is it going to include room numbers?
Thanks.
Is it going to include room numbers or just the entrances?
I believe just the entrances. The other thing to keep in mind is we also, if you're working with myself or Andrew Wilcox, we can work with facilities, we can work with deans, folks like Karen who manage the room reservations in campus unions or other facilities and spaces. Can also help advise you on the best spaces to reserve. If we know that, for example, a certain classroom is more accessible than another classroom, and a student comes forward and says, this is my need, sometimes it's just a matter of moving it down a floor, right? So we can work directly with you on those pieces, but the accessibility map mostly covers entrances, and at this point parking, but that would be a great addition in the future to think about those spaces specifically. All right, and then kind of one last call. So again, when we're sharing information, again, providing contact information for accommodations, think about alternate formats upon request. If you don't know how to do this, again, reaching out to myself, reaching out to Andrew Wilcox and his team, I'm happy to help you build these. I'm happy to help provide you with alternatives. Something that is really important to know is when the Department of Education made all these mandates, they also did a lot of work to support institutions, particularly smaller institutions. For example, most textbooks are available in large print. People forget that, people don't know that. So if a student needs large print, they can get it we can get it subsidized from the federal government. They can help us do that, they can help us identify resources. Another great resource, the librarians and folks who are in the Learning Commons who can help connect you to resources and services that provide alternatives and different formats of the materials that you're already using. But we want to think about things like making sure that when you're sending out a newsletter or printing something digitally, regardless of what department you're in, that if an individual is using an electronic reader, for example, that again, you're formatting that document in a way that's intuitive and that makes sense, right? I know it's really fun to do like really crazy lettering and have, you know, this pop-up bubble and this pop-up bubble and this pop-up bubble. But if you're not looking at the document and it's being read to you, and you hear this information and then this information and this information, and it doesn't make sense, don't do it that way, right? I'm so sorry, it's not fun and exciting, but try having my job, right? It's like not fun and exciting at all. And so, again, before, during, and after, kind of on our last note for best practices. When it comes to things like serving food, this is another area where, like, right, the peanut butter debate. How many of you like, just because your kid's allergic to peanut butter, my kid can't have peanut butter, right? Right. I know, yeah. So it's not about not having those things, it's about making nutritional information available. So that if someone has a food allergy, they can say, oh, I'm not gonna eat that. Problem solved. It doesn't mean you have to change, again, your tradition, you know, we always serve X, Y, and Z. It doesn't mean you have to change caterers, it doesn't mean any of those things, but it's a really simple thing that you can do that our vendors are obligated to provide to us, so it's not like you have to pick through and be like, what's in this chicken salad, right? They're obligated to provide it to us. So that's something simple, doesn't take a lot of time, it's not expensive, right? Again, information and nutritional facts available. No, again, highlight accessible parking. If we're having an event that's open to the public or to families, to admitted students, making sure that on mass emails and mailings that we're including accessible parking spaces. Like Lot 4, for example, right? We have a limited number of spaces for folks who may need van access, for example. While we may have a significant number of handicap spaces, right? Not all of them are van accessible. So keeping the difference of that in mind. Also have emergency plans in place. It's not something we want to think about every time you're planning a student event. But if there is an emergency, how do you help folks with limited mobility enter and exit those spaces? And then finally, and we have referenced this before, think about spaces where you're hosting the event and the message that that sends to the community and the folks who are invited and who are involved. And so those should, or hopefully, apply to each of your experiences. That being said, if there's anything that comes up, you're not in a position to have to figure it out on your own. I have an open door policy, you can make an appointment with me. If you want to run plans by me, if you have questions, if you need help, please let me know. I'm more than happy. And like I said, the best part about ADA that I think we discount is that we get credit for trying. There's nothing wrong with talking to a student or a coworker and saying, how can I do this best? Or what are ways that you've seen that work really well for you, right? You get credit for trying. Obviously, don't walk up to someone on the street and say, listen, I notice you have a physical disability and I'd love to pick your brain. Like, oh, that's so great, right? But if you're working directly with a student or a coworker to make accommodations, maybe they can help guide you, right? It's all on an individual basis, so that's what it's all about. But know that you have lots of resources and folks in place who are willing to help and who are more than happy to help. Thanks. Oh, best practices. Again, thought I was done, I lied. Share what you know. That's what I want the big takeaway to be. If you build a really great program or a format or a template to an event, if you have a document or a syllabi that you think is just awesome, share it with your department, share it with your division, share it with the folks that you work with. We're not in silos. Again, I think when it comes to some ADA and accommodation pieces, it's really overwhelming. When you find out something that works, share it, right? I'd love to have, examples to provide to other folks. That's awesome. So if you figure out something that works well or a good space to have a program, especially for folks like RAs or admissions who are doing a lot of things all over campus, sharing that information becomes invaluable. So share with area coordinators, share with graduate admissions versus undergrad admissions, right? This is all really helpful stuff, and it takes everyone to make this work. Again, and finally, if you don't know, ask. There's no problem in asking. Come to myself. For anyone who doesn't know, my office is located in the Campus Union. I'm in the Inclusion and Engagement Suite to the right side of the staircase. You can also, again, talk to Andrew Wilcox. He's the director of the Academic Success Center, who oversees disability support services. Any questions? I'm out of breath, literally. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it.